The second of the 10 commandments is the commandment of Lo yeh lecha elikim acherim al panai. You shall not have the gods of others in my presence. A story is told in the Talmud that the sages of Rome were asked, if God truly despises idolatry, why doesn't God destroy all the idols? So the sages replied, if the idolaters only served inanimate objects like stone and wood, then God would have destroyed the idols. But being that they deify also cosmic bodies like the sun and the moon, God will not destroy these bodies on behalf of the fools who serve them as gods. The non-believers asked the rabbis, if that is the case, let God only destroy those idols of stone and wood and allow the idols like the sun and the moon to exist. And the sages replied to these heathens that if God will destroy only the idols of wood and stone, then the worshippers of the sun and the moon will say, look, our idol is truly a god and our idol is stronger than yours. So from the second commandment we see clearly that God truly does not want idols. However, God gives man free choice to choose good over bad. And so tonight we're going to discuss this concept on 5 levels. On the level of Pshat and the level of Drush and Remez and Soid and Chassidus, and to try to understand how we could apply this mitzvah or this commandment to our daily lives. First and foremost, what is the simple interpretation of Lo yeh lecha elikim acherim? What does it mean you are not to have other gods? How can we call an idol a god, even another god? So Rashi, the classic commentator, the logician of the Torah, tells us on this very passage that the meaning of other gods means that others consider this to be a god, but not that they have any godly qualities. Rashi gives a second interpretation. Other gods means that they are strange and foreign gods. Normally, when you call upon God, our God, God listens. When the Jews were at the Red Sea and they prayed to God, the sea split. When a person has a problem, he prays to God, God answers his problem. However, these are strange gods because you pray to them and you call out to them, yet they don't recognize you. You are a stranger to them because they have no power to answer you. And then we have another interpretation brought down in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe says in chapter 22, why are these called other gods? Why are idols called other gods? So he says that the word other, acher, comes from the word achurayim, which means hinder part, from God's external will. In other words, everything in this world comes from God's energy and vitality. Nothing could exist in the world without God wanting it to exist. So therefore the question is, why do idols exist? As the question the heathens posed to the rabbis. And the answer is, God only allows them to exist through the hinder part. It's like throwing an object over one's shoulder and turning away one's face. God doesn't really want to do it, but he creates these idols to allow for free choice, for man to choose right over wrong. This is the concept of Pshat. Remez, what is the hint? The hint is that Lo yeh lecha elikim acherim, you shall not have any other gods before me. This is not only a command, but it's also a promise, and it's also future tense. In other words, God says, Lo yeh lecha elikim acherim, I promise that the time will come that the world will not have any other gods. And that will take place very soon when the Mashiach comes. At that time, it says, that God will remove the power of impurity from the world. And so too, He will remove all other foreign gods from the face of the earth. There's an interesting Medrash Tehillim that says that in the future, God will breathe life and spirit into the idols, and the idols will get up, and they will bow down before God. And the idols will turn to the idol worshippers, and they will point and they'll say, "Woe! Woe to you who spurned the Creator and bowed down instead to lifeless forms." So this is the remez, the hint for the future. And then we go on to the drush. What is the drush? The homiletics and the halacha is what the Rambam says in the book of mitzvos, mitzvah number 1. The Rambam says the first mitzvah is of the negative commandments that there's a prohibition from entertaining the thought that there's any deity other than God. And he says this is based on the statement of La Yiyah from Exodus 20, number 3, the second of the 10 commandments. And then the Rambam goes on to quote from the Gemara. And he says that on Sinai, God gave 613 commandments. Not only the 10 commandments as a whole, but really God taught Moshe the entire Torah over the 40 days of Sinai, 613 commandments. How do we know that God actually gave 613 commandments to the Jewish people? So the Rambam continues to quote the Gemara that says that the word Torah, the Torah has the gematria of 611. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe commanded us the Torah. Torah is 611. Then we have two more, 12 and 13. The first commandment and the second commandment. The first commandment is Anochi Hashem Lekecha, I am God your Lord. The second commandment is La Yiyah Lecha, you shall not have any other gods before you. These two commandments, God Himself spoke. So being that God spoke these two commandments, so we have 611 plus 2, we have now 613. Why did God only speak these two? As the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, because Anochi, I am God your Lord, this is the basis of all positive commandments. If you believe in God, do what God says. And therefore there are 248 positive commandments. Lo yiyeh lecha, you shall not have any gods before you, other gods before you. This represents the negative commandment. All negative commandments are derived from this commandment. 365 negative commandments. Because every time you do a negative commandment, you are violating, you shall not have any other gods before you. In other words, there's something more important than God. That's an idol. If you believe in God, how could you break my commandment? So therefore, La Yiyeh Lecha, you shall not have any other gods before you, represent all 365 negative commandments. So this is what we call the drush, the homiletics, how we understand the halachic ramifications from this commandment. And then we move on to the soid. What is soid? Soid means the esoteric. What do we derive from this passage? So we find that the Shalah Kodesh says in his commentary in Torah Shebiksav on this pasuk, he says, why does the Torah tell us you shall not have any other gods before you, al panai, as long as I live? Why does God make such a terminology, such a statement, as long as I live? We don't find such a statement in any of the other mitzvos in the Torah. We don't say, you know what, keep Shabbos, says God, as long as I live. Or eat matzah as long as I live. There's no such mitzvah. All of a sudden it comes to do not have idols. The Torah says, you know what? As long as I live, says God, you shall not have any other idols. Why do we have this terminology, alponai? And so, the Shalah Kodesh goes on to explain that we can understand this by understanding the history of idolatry. How did idolatry come into the world? As the Rambam says in the laws of idolatry, that it started in the very early days of Enosh. And what happened was that the people said like this: since God created the sun and the moon, and the purpose of the sun and the moon is to give us warmth and direction and inspiration, so therefore, being that the sun and the moon that gives us the heat and the light, etc., is doing the will of God, we should also thank it and acknowledge it for all the good things that it's doing. Similar to a minister. The king appoints a minister, and he tells the minister, you take care of this city. The people of the city don't only thank the king, they also thank the minister for carrying out the will of the king. And therefore, says the Rambam, that the people of that generation began to serve idols, and they say that we have to serve the sun and the moon because they have the ability to give us light and they have the ability to give us warmth. Eventually they went on to say also that now the sun and the moon is a god and they themselves asked us to serve them. But originally it was all about acknowledging God's creations. So says the Shalah Kodesh, in truth we know that God is different than all other kings. All other kings who are kings of flesh and blood cannot be at all places at all times. So therefore the kings do need ministers to represent them. And these ministers do have a free choice whether or not to do the king's will. But God is the omnipresent. God is at all places at all times. And therefore he does not need ministers to represent him. No sun, no moon, no angels, no stars. So what then is the purpose of the sun and the moon? The purpose of the sun and the moon is merely like a hatchet in the hand of a wood chopper. It has no power of its own. It has no knowledge to choose whether or not to do God's will. It simply does what God wants. And therefore, just like you wouldn't thank the hammer for banging in the nail, or just like you would not thank the hatchet for knocking down the tree, so too you don't thank the sun or the moon, but rather you have to thank God himself. So says the Shalah Kodesh, that's why the Torah uses the terminology alponai. God says, as long as I live, just like I live eternally, I always was, I am, and I always will be. I am not a king of flesh and blood. I am not finite. I am not human. Just like I am not human, therefore you do not bow down to any other gods. If I was a king of flesh and blood, I could understand it, says God. But alponai, I am eternal, and therefore I do not need any ministers. And the only one you should be bowing down to is me. And in truth, there's even a deeper concept. And that is, there are those who believe, of course God could do everything, but being that God is infinite, and God is Ein Sof, he's beyond time and space, and God is so powerful, why would God want to lower himself and have to deal with the nitty-gritty of every individual? So God creates the sun, and he creates the moon, and he creates many spirits, and they deal with the lower levels, and if there's a major problem, they go back to him for the questions. Here too comes along the pasuk and says, no, that's not the way God works. God is concerned about the welfare of every human being. God is concerned about the welfare of every animal. God is concerned about the welfare of every creation. He's involved. He wants, he loves, he's concerned. And therefore there's no reason to bow down to any other spirits or any other gods, for God himself takes care and is involved with nature and creation. And this is the meaning of Soid, the esoteric meaning of this commandment. And finally we move on to the fifth level, which is the level of Chassidus. And to understand this, we first have to preface the following. The Mechilta says like this. On the verse, Vayedaber Elikim es kol hadvarim ha'eleh, and God spoke all these words, which is the passage before the Ten Commandments, says that the Mechilta, you should know, Melamed, she'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, aseres hadibros b'dibur echad. You should know that God said all 10 commandments with one word. That's it, one word, and out came all 10 commandments. So if that is the case, why does the Torah mention again the 10 commandments? However, because we cannot understand 10 commandments with one word, so God again enumerated each one of the 10 commandments separately. That's what the Mechilta says. A similar verse we find in Tehillim, in the book of King David, the book of Psalms. And King David says like this, Achas diber alikim shtayim zu shemoti. King David says, you should know, God said one word, Achas, and we heard two things. In other words, according to this view, God said the first and the second of the 10 commandments together. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God your Lord, and the commandment of Lo yeh lecha elikim acherim, you shall not have any other gods. Both of these commandments God said at the same exact time. And here again the question is, what was the purpose? Can God do it? Of course he could do it. God could do everything. He's God. But if man needs to learn from God, and we have to hear the 10 commandments, what was the purpose and what was God's objective by saying all 10 commandments in one word, or by saying the first and second commandment as one commandment? What's the message and what is the teaching? And the answer is as follows. God, who is the giver, is one. And therefore everything he says is one. In other words, a human being or a Jew who studies the Torah will find 613 commandments and perhaps would think there are 613 different avenues or 613 different approaches or 613 different powers that exist. Comes along the Torah and says, no, you should know that God said all 10 commandments with one word. Why? Because everything is one. However, this concept of one, of oneness, is only applicable when we refer to the position or the point of view of the giver, who is God. God is one, and therefore everything he does is one. However, the receiver, the finite individual, by us it's two. We cannot internalize everything as one. And therefore for us, God says, I am God your Lord, a positive commandment. And Lo yeh lecha elikim acherim, you shall not have other gods before me, which is a negative commandment. In other words, the human being has to divide all of the Torah into two groups, positive and negative, because we cannot internalize everything as one. Now what does that mean? On a simple level, it means as follows. When a person does a positive commandment, when you do a mitzvah, for example, you eat matzah on Pesach, you blow the shofar Rosh Hashanah, you light a Shabbos candle Friday night, what happens? What is taking place in the cosmos? And the answer is, when you do a positive commandment, you are bringing new light into the world. You are bringing new blessing into the world. You are bringing new vitality into the world. That is the objective, and that is the blessing that one receives for doing a positive commandment. What is the objective of a negative commandment? In other words, don't kill, don't steal, don't eat treif, non-kosher. And now you have a desire that you want to kill, you have a desire that you want to steal, you have a desire to eat a non-kosher hamburger, and you resist, you refrain yourself, you don't do it. says the Kabbalah, at that moment, God destroys the negative powers in the world. Every time we hold back and we negate the performance of a sin, we don't violate a negative commandment, God removes impurity from the world. He negates and eradicates the powers of evil. So really, at first glance, the positive commandment is bringing light into the world, and the negative commandment is negative. It is removing and eradicating negative energy from the universe. Yet, we are told that God said both of these things together. The first commandment and the second commandment together. The positive and the negative commandment together. Why? Because in truth, it's really one. What does it mean it's really one? When you do a positive commandment, you bring light into the world. But when you do a negative commandment, you bring a greater power and light into the world. They are both really positive. They are both really one. In other words, it is true that when you don't do a negative commandment, you don't kill, or you don't steal, yes, God eradicates evil from the world, but at the same time, there's also a positive thing taking place, and that is God brings into the world a greater light, a greater vitality, a greater energy than when one performs a positive commandment. And this energy is so great, it's so awesome, that the only way we could tap into it is by not doing. Because our vessels are not large enough to elicit this power and this light. So in essence, Achas Diber Elikim. God said one thing. It's all about God. It's all about bringing God's light into the world. Every positive and negative commandment achieves the same goal. However, for us, as humans, it's easier for us to internalize positive and negative. Which, by the way, this concept answers another interesting question. And that is, on one hand, we say when Mashiach will come, this Torah will continue. All the 613 commandments of the Torah will exist even after the coming of Mashiach. On the other hand, when Mashiach comes, God will remove the spirit of impurity from the world. There will be no evil, no sin, no death, no pain, no suffering, no envy, no war. So, if there will be no evil in the world, what will be the purpose of doing a negative commandment? Why do we need 365 negative commandments? We just said the purpose is to remove evil, to eradicate the powers of impurity. But if there will be only purity, and there will be no evil after Mashiach comes, why then do we still have to follow the 365 negative commandments? But the answer is, as we said earlier, that in truth, even when it comes to a negative commandment, we are also eliciting a positive light. And this light is so great that the light of the negative commandment is even greater than the light of the positive commandment. So therefore, in conclusion, what is the purpose of God saying the first and the second commandment together? To remind us that everything in the world is one. And therefore, every time we do a mitzvah, a positive commandment or a negative commandment, we have one thought in mind. And that is the purpose of everything is to unite with God. For the word mitzvah means tzav tzav v'chibur. It means connection. And therefore we connect with God not only by doing something positive, by putting on the tefillin, by lighting the Shabbos candle, but we can also connect with God by not doing, by simply refraining from doing the sin. and overcoming our temptations, we also have the ability to have that mitzvah, that connection with God. So we hope and pray that by learning about the Ten Commandments and following the Ten Commandments and going to the shul on Shavuos to hear the Ten Commandments, we will merit to see very soon the coming of Mashiach, when Ruach HaTumah Avim in Haaretz and the spirit of impurity will be removed from the face of this earth. And furthermore, Mufsari Elzal Lakah, that our flesh itself will see God with the coming of Mashiach speedily in our days.